Are you going out like that? The Hunter sisters stopped on the bottom step as their father's voice floated through the hallway, Sophie looking back with resignation at her older sister Lily, who was descending the stairs behind. She said nothing in reply, instead shrugging her shoulders as if to say, "What can you do?" "Which one of us are you talking to?" she called out. One hand tucked into his jeans pocket, the other holding a steaming mug of instant coffee, Dad appeared at the doorway into the kitchen. Eyes bleary, he was unshaven, his hair as tousled as his grumpy old Git t-shirt was rumpled. An engineer with the electricity company, he had completed a run of night shifts only this morning, and had not long woken up after catching a few hours well-earned but restless kip. "Guess," he said. With a little knowledge, it did not take a genius to work that one out. Lily was wearing her favorite jeans with the oh-so-fashionable rips, a pair of Converse trainers and her favorite long, baggy mustard-colored jumper, her long, ash-blonde hair flowing freely down her back. Sophie, on the other hand, was rather more smartly dressed in black and red, with a short skirt showing off her long legs. She cocked her head to one side, wavy, mid-brunette-colored hair brushing against the nape of her neck. "Are you talking to your eldest daughter or your youngest one?" she asked coolly. Their father smiled and took a sip of tea. "Well, it's certainly not my son, that's for sure." "Not today, it looks like." Sophie looked herself up and down, a note of uncertainty in her voice. "I think I'm looking okay." "You're looking wonderful," he smiled. "As of course is my eldest daughter," he added as Lily opened her mouth to protest. "So? For my youngest daughter, you're looking wonderful. As for my son..." He tailed off and shook his head ruefully, a smile on his face. "I don't know what your Uncle Kevin would say." "Uncle Kevin would say that Sophie is looking stunning," Lily interjected. "You know he would." Their father suppressed a yawn and nodded. That he would, amazingly, as he used to have quite a lot to say about what he called pansies and poofs. Lily shot him a look that could have stripped the armor plating from a battleship. For her part, Sophie merely rolled her eyes. "Uncle Kevin just needed some enlightenment," Lily muttered sourly. "He certainly got that the first time he clapped eyes on Sophie," Dad agreed. "Where you off to then?" "Into town," Lily replied. "Some shopping, meeting with friends, that kind of thing. You know, a social life. You used to have one of them, Dad, didn't you?" "Yes," he nodded. "I did. Then your mother found out she was pregnant with you. And that was the end of that." Lily smiled winningly. "You do the crime, you do the time," she told him sweetly. 16 years, he remarked. "We must be eligible for that parole hearing by now." Lily gave him a silent ha-ha. "Out," he told them. "And be careful." This last was meant more for Sophie. As they disappeared out of the front door, he wondered, not for the first time, if his offspring thought he had come up with the last daisy, and his lips smiled as he took another sip of coffee. Sophie always liked to dress in a way that accentuated her femininity, but that was a special effort look today. Interesting, he thought. He wondered who she was meeting, reckoning that dressed like that, it was not likely to be another girl. Still, unlike Lily, at least he and their mother didn't have to worry about her getting pregnant. "Do you think he believed us?" Sophie asked worriedly as the two of them made their way through the rabbit warren that comprised the modern housing estate the family lived in. "Oh yeah," Lily replied carelessly. "You know Dad." And she held up a hand with all but her little finger folded down. "Wrapped right around there. Ever since I was a baby." Sophie thought sometimes that Lily overestimated her powers of dad control, but wisely said nothing. Besides, she thought, she was lying outright to him, or at least being economical with the truth, and that did not sit easy with her. That was how she was able to be out in a skirt, heels and makeup, after all. By being honest about it. 14-year-old Jackson had known at quite a young age that he liked to wear girls' clothing. He liked the feel of the soft material on his skin, so different from his own shirts and trousers, and the look of them. Lily's wardrobe became a regular target on those rare occasions when he could indulge, and he managed to keep it hidden for quite a few years. Slowly he evolved his look, keeping his hair a little longer, trying makeup and cosmetics. Then, one day, when he was 11 and his sister was 13, she acted on suspicions she had had for quite a while. It was little things, makeup not always quite where she had left it, her clothes drawers just a little untidier than they ought to have been, that sort of thing. Jackson was generally quite careful, but now and then complacency crept in. Sneaking back into the house one afternoon when only her brother was in, she caught him unawares in her bedroom. Jackson was wearing Lily's faded denim cut-off shorts and an off-the-shoulder t-shirt with a Union Jack design that she'd picked up in a retro fashion shop. His hair, which at that stage was not very long, was gathered at the back and secured with a hair claw, and he'd made up his face with quite some skill. He'd looked at her in shock, wide-eyed and frightened at her sudden entrance. Lily had been working herself into a temper for this moment, ready to open up with both barrels, but at the sight of him standing in front of the mirror she instead stood open-mouthed in the doorway. "Shit," she exclaimed. "You're gorgeous." Jackson's pretty face had crumpled and, to her horror, he started crying at that. Lily forgot all feelings of rage at her suspicions being proved right, and instead hurried to her brother, hugging him and letting him sob into her shoulder. Afterwards, when he had settled down, they sat on her bed and talked, he with mascara-tinted tracks down his cheeks. Jackson told her that in a way he was relieved that somebody had found out. His fears of discovery, which had always been there ever since he first put on a pair of Lily's knickers, and which dominated his thoughts whenever he could indulge, had finally blown up in his face, and he realized now that didn't have to hide it away. "If that's okay," he told her. "I'm very sorry for borrowing your things without telling you. I won't do it again if you dash." She gave him a little smile, cutting him off. "You look great in them," she said truthfully. "You can borrow my stuff anytime you want." Lily became a great help to Jackson after that. She taught him a lot more about using cosmetics and what was the best for his skin color, as well as color coordination. Jackson had the usual male lack of aptitude about such things. She encouraged him to grow his hair longer, as there was nothing in the school rules about boys having long hair, and educated him in how to act female. She was by his side when he went out, very nervously, for the first time as Sophie. It was just a walk down to a local coffee shop and a convenience store, but the combination of her teaching and his hard work made it a great success. He could pass as a girl so easily, and his confidence blossomed as a result. Telling their parents was the next stage. Lily and Sophie met up with Liam outside the railway station. It was only a 20-minute walk from their front door. Liam was Jackson's best friend, and had been so since they started primary school together as 5-year-olds. They shared a lot of interests and had spent many hours together, getting into scrapes and having adventures. Unlike the shorter, quieter Jackson with his slim frame, Liam was loud and boisterous, the natural leader of the two and an excellent all-rounder at sports. He had a large frame, and more than once had come to his smaller friend's aid at school when he was being picked on. In return, Jackson, as the more scholarly of the two, regularly helped him with aspects of academic work he found difficult. They were a good foil for each other, and made a good team. After Lily, Liam had been the first person to meet Sophie. He had been stunned at the transformation of his quiet, bookish friend into this outgoing, confident girl. That he would be disgusted about it or fall out with Jackson was unthinkable. They were best friends, and he accepted without question this hitherto unknown facet of Jackson's life. He'd even taken Sophie out on a couple of dates. Nothing special, mind, just a trip to the cinema or for a pizza. There was no romance, and they certainly never kissed. Neither wanted to go down that particular rabbit hole. Instead, they accommodated Sophie as the third member of their dynamic duo, deciding that if Jackson had the brains and Liam had the brawn, then Sophie most definitely had the looks. Liam had recently started to go out with Lily, despite the fact she was a couple of years older. With his height and build he looked 16, and though Jackson wasn't sure how he felt about it, he had to admit that they were good for each other. Besides, they were his favorite two people in the world, so it would be very churlish of him to complain. Particularly after what Sophie was going to be doing today. "Hi, stud," Lily greeted Liam, giving him a hug and a kiss. "Hi, Lily," he replied. "Sophie," he added quickly. "No problem. I know I'm invisible here," Sophie said good-naturedly. "How do I look? Good enough?" "Oh, sure," Liam told her absent-mindedly, earning a sigh of exasperation from her and an elbow in the ribs from Lily. "I'll what?" he asked, looking from one of them to the other, mystified. "Men," Lily muttered, before changing the subject. "Have you got the ticket?" Liam produced the little orange and yellow card. "Right here," he announced, and handed it to Sophie. "And he left on the last train." Sophie slipped the ticket into her bag. Liam became serious for a moment. "Thanks for doing this, sophomore. I appreciate it. And you are looking great. Really." Awkwardly he leaned in and gave her a peck on the cheek, his face reddening as he did so. "Don't ruin the makeup," Lily warned him. She turned to Sophie. "Hope you have a good time. And hope he doesn't have too much of a shock." Her sister smiled. "I guess I'll find out soon enough." They parted company after that, Sophie walking into the station, where she used the ticket Liam had bought for her to go through the automatic gate line and onto the platform. Lily and Liam left to stroll into town, arms around each other, out to enjoy the early spring sunshine. Sophie's train soon arrived, and before long she was sat by a window as the suburban sprawl of Bournemouth and its environs slipped by, thumbs dancing across her mobile phone like any other teenaged girl. It was barely a 15-minute journey to her destination, so she didn't have to get too comfortable. When Jackson decided to tell his family about Sophie, Lily came up with the idea of introducing her at a family get-together. At first, he was very resistant. Telling Mom and Dad was one thing, but their grandparents? Their misogynistic and racist Uncle Kevin with his very un-PC attitudes towards bummers and homos? "I think it's the best way," she told him. "You'll only have to do it the once." He refused for quite some time, but eventually she wore him down, and they decided to do it on Boxing Day. Mom and Dad always offered to host the family on the 26th of December. It was stressful as hell for Mom, who usually had at least one breakdown. The alcohol flowed freely. Auntie Claire usually tried to take over in the kitchen. Grandpa told the same old stories about his time in the Navy. There were the usual arguments and reopened wounds and occasionally a threat of violence. In other words, it was a traditional family Christmas. Jackson had to agree that what was one more drama in the day amongst the rest of it. Besides, half of them would probably be drunk anyway. During early afternoon, with the house bulging at the seams with various family members and the tension slowly building happily, he and Lily disappeared up to her bedroom. Quickly he stripped off his male clothing and, with Lily's help, became Sophie. For the occasion she had bought a deep green sleeveless dress with a round neck, reaching down to just above her knees, with a wide black belt, black tights and a pair of 3-inch black court shoes. This all went on over some new underwear that she had bought herself for Christmas, a matching padded bra and panties. As she did not have time to do her nails properly, she settled for self-adhesive acrylic nails matching the dress. A necklace with a dolphin charm that had been a gift from Lily went around her neck, and after she brushed her hair out and secured it with a barrette, she clipped a pair of jaunty Christmas bauble earrings to her lobes, lightly applied some makeup and gave herself a quick squirt of perfume. Nervously she followed Lily downstairs, her heart thumping like a pipe and drum band, and waited at the bottom of the stairs while Lily went into the lounge. Most of the family were there, conversation being thrown around with the occasional accusation. Both sets of grandparents, Uncle Tim and Aunt Claire, Uncle Joel and Aunt Eve, Uncle Kevin and his latest girlfriend/tart, delete as appropriate, their 3 younger cousins, and Jim and Sylvie from next door. She wondered what the hell she was doing. "Can I have everybody's attention?" Lily shouted loudly, her voice cutting through the hubbub like a drill. When everybody fell silent and looked at her expectantly, she smiled. "Thank you. As it's Christmas, and all of you are present, Jackson and I felt that it would be the most appropriate time to do this. So I would like to take this opportunity to introduce a very dear and wonderful person to you all. She's been keen to meet you, if nervous about it, but we thought why not? It is my great and proud honor to present to you my gorgeous, beautiful sister, Sophie Hunter." That was it. Feeling as if she was no longer in control of her legs and overcoming the desire to run away as quickly as possible, Sophie took the short walk across the hall and through the door before she could change her mind. It felt like she was wading through treacle, but she smiled nervously as she looked around the room. Faces, young and old, looked at her with a mixture of incomprehension, bemusement and confusion, and about 1,000,000 years passed before Mom, who had been in the kitchen, came into the lounge from the other end. "Oh, Jackson," she said matter-of-factly. "Good. It's about time you told us about wearing girls' clothes." At that, everybody started to speak at once. Mom and Dad looked at each other and merely smiled smugly. Their 3 young cousins just gaped open-mouthed at Sophie, and the family thought it was a wonderful joke. Uncle Kevin didn't, he just sat in the armchair and scowled. For her part, Sophie was rooted to the spot, unable to move. Lily gripped her hand as they waited for the uproar to die down. She suddenly realized that Dad was making his way across the room to stand next to her, pulling his garish Christmas jumper off, and her own mouth dropped open as she read the words on the t-shirt he was wearing underneath it, "You don't scare me. I have 2 daughters." He grinned at her and gave her a big hug. She looked at Lily accusingly. "Did you tell him?" she asked, receiving a shake of the head in reply. "We're not stupid," Dad said. "We do notice things. At least, your mom does. We suspected this for months." "But how?" "Little things," says your mom. Extra items in the laundry that she didn't recognize for one. We eventually put 2 and 2 together and waited for you to tell us. You're not angry? Hey, we all do crazy things when we're young. You should have seen what I got up to. This is your crazy thing. I had a feeling you might reveal it today. You and Lily have been shooting secretive looks at each other all day. Hence the t-shirt." He smiled. "Hence the t-shirt. And you're looking amazing. After the sisters explained to the family where Sophie had come from, they accepted her presence surprisingly well. Her aunts complimented her on her look. Her male cousin, only 7 years old, kept repeating, "But you're wearing a dress," in amazement, while the grandparents thought it was a hilarious joke. Uncle Kevin, of course, barely spoke to her for the rest of the day, though his latest girlfriend/tart, delete as appropriate, was very friendly. Just another Christmas drama. And life carried on. Over 12 months later, even Uncle Kevin now accepted her alongside Jackson. Maybe not entirely approved, but accepted. 17-year-old Robbie Hale stood nervously under the big Ferris wheel that stood in front of the pier, the riders in the little cars seeming to frown down at him in disapproval. The older brother of Liam, Robbie shared his height and athletic frame, though he was first to admit that when it came to sports, he did not have his brother's aptitude and enthusiasm. Aside from some running and the occasional sparring with Liam with boxing gloves, instead he leaned more towards the academic. He was well into his A-level studies, and was intending to study archaeology or something similar at Bournemouth Uni. He shared his brother's good looks, but had none of his confidence. His tousled, curly hair was the same honey blonde, he wore frameless spectacles, and was wearing a kingfisher blue shirt and dark jeans, a beige jacket over the top, and an unsynchronized clash of colors. Robbie was standing there at 3 o'clock that Saturday afternoon, constantly checking his watch, with the world passing by, because he had been foolish enough to let his brother set up a blind date for him. Part of him was scornful of Liam's sincerity about it, and part of him desperately hoped it wasn't with somebody like Kimberly Watts, a girl from college so white that she had been likened cruelly if understandably to a Sherman tank and drag. Robbie's problem was that his lack of confidence was the same with girls as with everything else. He'd been on a couple of dates before, generally disastrous ones, when the girl with him realized he wasn't quite like his brother, and had not had a girlfriend since the age of 6. And that didn't really count. Not if he was honest. Liam, who was getting on very well with Lily Hunter despite her being 2 years above him in school, had persuaded him to let him set him up with a girl. What Robbie did not know was that Liam, having confidently boasted of finding him a good date, had struggled to fulfill his side of the bargain. Oh, he had tried for sure, but those he had sussed out weren't interested enough. Robbie had a reputation for being a geek and, well, a bit wimpy, despite his size. Also, Liam did not really know that many girls of his brother's age. Eventually he had turned to the one girl he really knew well, partly out of desperation and partly because it appealed to his mischievous nature. To his surprise, Sophie had agreed. As the minute hand wound its way onto the hour, Robbie looked around him, thinking that either Liam had been having a laugh all along or he'd been stood up. He couldn't blame anyone for the latter. He was not an ideal catch for any girl, not really, and hi Robbie. He almost jumped out of his skin at the soft, strangely familiar voice that had spoken behind him, and turned to see who it was. He saw a girl, possibly a year or 2 younger than him, standing smiling coyly at him. Shoulder-length wavy dark hair secured by a narrow red Alice band, and with a smile on her fair, unblemished face, sea green eyes twinkling at him, she was slim, with small breasts. She was dressed in what seemed to him to be a sophisticated, yet almost bookish manner, a thin black ribbed jumper with a turtleneck tucked into an above-knee black and red tartan skirt, black tights and chunky-heeled black knee-high boots. A small, neat silver shoulder bag was clutched in her hands, dark nail polish catching the light, and star-shaped gold ear-rings glinted with a matching necklace. At first his breath was taken away. She was gorgeous. Then he looked a bit closer, and suddenly recognized who his date was. He sighed with exasperation. "I suppose this is Liam trying to be funny," he growled bitterly, his anger rising to the surface. "Very funny, Liam." "What do you mean?" Sophie asked, confused. He looked up from his mobile, where he had started texting an angry message to his brother. "Oh, come on, Jackson," he snapped. "Liam offers to set me up with a girl and he sends you. Why didn't I see that coming? Stupid prick. He has set you up with a girl," she insisted. "And my name's Sophie, by the way." "Sure he has." His voice dripped sarcasm. Sophie gave a cute twirl in front of him. "Am I not a girl?" she asked. "Do I look like a boy to you?" "But you're not a girl, are you?" he snarled, looking at her. "Aren't I?" "No, 'cause you've got a penis," he told her, loud enough to surprise a couple of passers-by. Sophie ignored the sudden slice of hurt the comment brought, and suppressed the flash of anger that threatened to rise to the surface. "Well, if that's your only reason," she scowled, and suddenly reached out and grabbed the mobile from his hand. He looked down at her. "Hey, give that BA- now listen to me, Robbie Hale," Sophie said, a surprisingly hard edge to her voice as she let a little of her anger out. "Liam asked me to be your blind date because he wanted somebody he could trust that wouldn't stand you up and is quite happy to spend an afternoon with you and have a good time together. To misquote someone, I know I do not have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a queen." Her voice softened. "Liam loves you. He looks up to you, you know." "Really?" Robbie was surprised. "Of course, he does. You're his big brother. He wouldn't do anything to hurt you, even if he can be a prat at times." "He hasn't done this out of pity, has he?" he asked suddenly, suspicious. She shook her head. "No. And neither have I. I was genuinely touched that he felt he could ask me to do this, and as I said, I'm quite happy to do it." She offered the phone back. "Now, no angry messages to him, just ones that tell him how much you're enjoying the day." "I think we both will." He took the phone back, his frame relaxing. "Okay," he said gruffly. "I'm sorry for going off on one like that. And I shouldn't have made that remark about you having, yeah, but you can't blame me for what I thought." "No," she acquiesced. "But maybe you should listen first and shoot later?" Robbie nodded. "Well," he said, looking her up and down with renewed interest. "Can we start again?" He held out his hand and Sophie took it, shaking it. Robbie took a step back, looking her up and down. "I have to say you're looking great, Sophie." "Sophie. Sorry, I couldn't remember your girly name." "No problem. So, what do you have in mind for today?" He shrugged. The ideas he had come up with seemed to go out of his head. "Well, perhaps, if you like, we could hang out down around the pier. Go to the arcade, maybe." Sophie looked at him pityingly. "Now that might be something Jackson would like to do, but he isn't here, is he?" she asked reasonably. "Why don't you buy me an iced coffee and we'll talk about it?" As it happened, Sophie had a salted caramel frappe while Robbie decided on a black coffee. "They say that people who drink black coffee are more likely to be serial killers," she said genially as they sat down at the pavement table, having forgiven him for his earlier outburst. They'd walked back up through the immaculately kept lower gardens to the town center, making for one of the many coffee shop chains that cluttered the shop fronts. He smiled. "Yes, I've read that. And those who have weird multicolored drinks topped with cream are more likely to be their victims." "Oh dear," she said, eyes widening in mock innocence. "Will I need to take care today?" "Definitely," he said daringly. "You never know what might happen." She smiled mischievously. And you might have to make good on remarks like that. Robbie blushed furiously while she laughed at his discomfort, and they went on to plan their afternoon. The big entertainment complex on the beachfront, in one of its many function rooms, was hosting an exhibition of film and television props. Robbie, first to admit his geek credentials, asked if Sophie might possibly be interested in seeing that. She smiled and replied that, yes, she would like that a lot. He also suggested that they could grab a pizza afterwards and then maybe catch a film at the cinema. Sophie agreed that his itinerary sounded like a perfect first date, and after they had drunk their coffee set off back through the gardens. Robbie was more than a little surprised when Sophie put her hand in his. So was she, for that matter. But it seemed the right thing to do. The exhibition was mostly made up of costumes and props from genre film and television, the display going under the unimaginative title Beyond the Final Frontier. Accordingly, it started with a small number of costumes from Star Trek, including a rare red uniform dress as worn by Lieutenant Uhura from the 1960s. I must get one like that, Sophie muttered, looking it over approvingly, taking in its rank braiding and the Starfleet emblem. You'd look great in it, Robbie told her sincerely. They worked their way around the exhibition, seeing a goodly collection of items. Here was Han Solo's blaster pistol, while over there was Arnold Schwarzenegger's leather jacket from the second Terminator film, while glaring at them menacingly from another display cabinet was one of Professor Quatermass Knightsbridge Martians from the 1950s. Sophie posed for a photo with a Dalek, and they persuaded a mannequin dressed as a xenomorph from Alien to join them for a selfie. They were delighted to find James Bond's Aston Martin DB5 and Kit from Knight Rider. Despite Robbie's best attempts to engage the modified black Trans Am in conversation, much to Sophie's giggled amusement, the normally chatty Kit remained obstinately quiet, his distinctive red light sweeping from side to side balefully. I think he's asleep, Sophie laughed. She was pleased to see that Robbie had relaxed and was enjoying himself. She had been quite nervous what his reaction would be and, truth to be told, she couldn't entirely blame him for being angry. Her remarks about Liam looking up to him and the reasons he asked her were complete fabrication, but she figured a little white lie wouldn't hurt. She was pleased that he had been treating her like a girl ever since, and, she had to admit, he was quite good company. They were just leaving the center, descending the stone steps of the imposing, angular building, when her phone pinged, and she saw a text from Lily asking how it was going. All good, she replied, adding a thumbs up. Robbie raised his eyebrows questioningly. Just Lily checking up, she said. I told her it was awful and could she invent a family emergency to get me out of it. For a moment he looked at her in surprised hurt, before her laugh told him she was joking. You're not supposed to enjoy it, he scolded her in relief as they strolled back into the town. He followed her in and out a couple of clothes shops, waiting patiently as Sophie had a look through the sale rails. He was surprising himself, and realized that he was enjoying himself immensely, as he watched her. He had only met Jackson's female alter ego a handful of times in the past, and while not understanding why his brother's best friend did it, he had, like everybody else, been stunned how good he was at transforming himself, and how convincing he was as a girl. But looking at her now, her slim frame in the tartan skirt, her hair hanging free, with her black tights and boots, it was impossible to think of Jackson. Underneath the image was a boy like himself, he had to keep reminding himself, with balls and a penis. He shook his head. Jackson's Sophie was so natural, so confident that it seemed that this was her real form, that Jackson was a male facade she put on rather than the other way around. It was unnerving. Just as unnerving at the thoughts he was having about her. She was gorgeous, and he felt so easy, so relaxed around her, as if they'd been doing this for years. It almost made him want to reach out to touch her, to squeeze her shoulder and press his cheek against her hair, to turn her round and press his lips to hers and no, stop it. Where did that come from? He wondered, shocked at the thought. He couldn't imagine kissing another boy. Could he? And he suddenly noticed that his own penis was stirring into life. As Sophie had said earlier, am I not a girl? Do I look like a boy to you? What do you think of this one? The object of his confusion asked him suddenly. Totally ignorant of the effect she was having on him, she turned around and held up a blue off-the-shoulder summer top against herself. Oh, yeah, that's a good one, he replied, suddenly aware that if she looked too closely, she would notice the commotion in his crotch. Thankfully she didn't, and she put the top back on the rail and smiled at him, her eyes twinkling. Come on, she said. You're bored stiff. Let's get pizza. Okay, maybe she had. Again, he allowed himself to take her hand, and she led the way out of the shop and into the fresh, cool spring air, where he suddenly realized how hot he had been feeling in there. He really wasn't sure if Sophie seemed totally unaware of the effect she was having on him, and as he was guided towards the pizza parlor he tried to get his thoughts in order. They took their boxed pizzas to the beachfront, sitting on a seat and watching as the tide slowly rolled in across the sand. The sun was sinking towards the horizon, and the warmth it had brought earlier was beginning to dissipate. So where did you come from, Sophie? Robbie asked, licking tomato sauce from his fingers. It was a question he had thought about asking his brother's best friend more than once, intrigued. What you mean? She asked, a triangle of barbecue chicken pausing on the journey to her mouth. Well, most teenaged boys only have one life, but you created a second one to run alongside it. And I have to say you are totally convincing. I know you're a boy underneath, but even I have trouble believing it. Anyone who didn't know would never suspect. Sophie swallowed her mouthful of pizza and washed it down with some Pepsi Max before replying. Thank you, she said. It's always great to know that my efforts to pass are good enough. As to your question, well, it's something that evolved over a long time. I was attracted to what girls wore, and it just went from there. My confidence grew, Lily helped, and Sophie was created. These days I'm happy as either, and school is the only place where you can be sure that Sophie will not be. Do your friends know about it? As well as Liam, of course. Oh yeah. Since I was introduced to the family I've been totally open about it, and most of my friends have met Sophie outside of school. Any negative reactions? She nodded, chewing on pizza crust. Yes, she replied eventually. Them as well. But Lily and Liam are great as a support crew. Has Liam told you about Albie Foster? Isn't he the school bully? I've seen him around. She laughed. That's him. Albie Tosser, as I like to call him. Well, that dickhead's had it in for me ever since primary school, and this just became something else for him to use. Name-calling mostly. Ladyboy, poofter, queer, and so on. Nothing original. Point me at him, Robbie told her daringly. I'll sort him out. She looked at him with renewed affection. That's very sweet of you, she said. But he's not worth the effort. Thing is, I'm not sure how long Sophie will be around. What do you mean? Robbie was startled by her words, and felt an unbidden wave of disappointment at them. She shrugged. Puberty has been somewhat late in getting around to me. So far, I've shown very little signs of it, but I do wonder if, when it hits, it will enable me to keep being Sophie. Hairy arms and a deep voice aren't very girlish. I don't know. You should see some of the girls at college, he said, earning an appreciative grin from his date. That's the problem, she continued, more seriously. Now I could roll through puberty without any problems, be one of those small, slim guys. Or I could suddenly broaden out, develop a voice like Darth Vader and look like Albie Tosser. If so, that will be the end for Sophie. What about puberty blockers? I've thought about it. I would probably have to say goodbye to Jackson if I do, though. It's very complicated. I like to be both, but one day I'm going to have to choose. There was an air of gloom around her reply, and they ate the rest of their pizzas in silence. When they had finished, Robbie put the rubbish in a nearby bin. He hated the sort of people who would just leave it on the seat and sat back down. He watched as Sophie took out her mirror and touched up her maroon-colored lipstick, and again he was struck by the notion that this was the real person, not Jackson. When she was done, she put it away and, to his surprise, leaned against him, putting her head against his shoulder. To his even bigger surprise, he put his arm around her, and for a while they watched the sky turn purple. Eventually Sophie looked at her watch and said, "Well, if we're going to catch a film, we'd best get going." Robbie asked. "Oh, yeah, I guess we should." She looked up at him. She had not expected to say as much as she had about her concerns, and thought how easy Robbie was to speak to. As Jackson, she had known him for years, though due to the age difference, never closely. Sophie certainly felt closer to him than Jackson ever had, and it was introducing thoughts she had never had before. Certainly not about any boy. What a day it was turning out to be. They walked hand in hand through the chilly early evening up to the Odeon multiplex and, stepping inside, viewed the selection. "Horror?" Robbie asked. "You might get into a 15-rated film, but I'm screwed if they want proof of identity," she replied. "Ah. There's the latest Marvel film. What would Sophie like to see?" Robbie asked gallantly. She scanned the boards. "A lack of rom-coms, and I definitely don't want anything tough and gritty about sex workers in Venezuela. Oh, special showings of Singing in the Rain all week. Ever heard of it?" "Vaguely. Music and dancing. An oldie. Gene Kelly, Donald O'Connor and Debbie Reynolds," she read. "I've heard of Gene Kelly, but not the others." "We can give it a try," Robbie said. "It's something different." "Why not?" Sophie told him. "You get the tickets, I'll get the popcorn." "Deal." Before long they were making their way into the darkened auditorium. Robbie had selected seats in the back row, much to Sophie's amusement and his embarrassment once he realized what he'd done, and they settled in. There were very few people present, no more than half a dozen, and everybody was well spaced out. It was a small audience for a Saturday evening screening, and she imagined that many of those who would naturally be drawn to the film were not naturally Saturday evening kind of people. As they sat through the interminable car and mobile phone ads and then the trailers, she reflected on the day. It had been really enjoyable, and she was still trying to figure out why she was having thoughts about Robbie she surely shouldn't. Well, ones that Jackson shouldn't. As a girl, was she attracted to him? Well, in a funny way, yes. He was good company, quite good-looking with a lovely, gentle smile and had an endearing, almost gawkish manner. When she'd been sitting with his arm around her on the seafront, she'd felt a strange glow of, well, she wasn't sure what it could be called, exactly, but she almost hoped he would lean down and kiss her. It had been quite overwhelming. As the lights darkened and the film started, she tried to concentrate on it, popcorn in her lap. About the point when Gene Kelly's character, the silent movie actor Don Lockwood, was singing the song You Were Meant for Me to Debbie Reynolds in an empty studio that he had lit specially to show her his feelings for her, she noticed with a thrill that Robbie had put his hand on her knee. His touch felt warm through the nylon, and she was suddenly aware how much she liked it being there. After a while she put her hand on top of it, lacing her fingers with his and then sliding his hand down so it was resting on the inside of her thigh. Ooh, that was even better. Shortly afterwards she became aware that Robbie had turned his head towards her. Noticing the light of the screen catching the edges of his spectacles, she faced him. She could not see his features, but somehow she knew that he was asking permission, and she very much decided she wanted to grant it. Her heartbeat seemed to pound in her ears, and she leaned across slowly to meet him, their lips searching for each other in the dark. Then they touched. Oh wow! He tasted of him, and she allowed his tongue to probe her mouth tentatively, cautiously, as hesitant as she was. She closed her eyes, the words of the song drifting through her head as her own tongue played with his, feeling the heat of it. Neither Jackson nor Sophie had ever kissed or been kissed like this before, and it was beyond anything she could have imagined. Their lips eventually parted, and they gazed at each other, 1,000 feelings passing between them. There was surprise and shock, but something else. Something deeper, and Sophie wondered if this was what love felt like. But how could it be love? Robbie was a boy. And you're a girl, she told herself. At this moment, in this place, you are a girl. Of course you could be in love with a boy. What could be more natural? She let out a long sigh of contentment and leaned in to kiss him again. This time it was even better. Had Sophie been quizzed on the film afterwards, she would not have been able to have answered many of the questions. The same was probably true of Robbie, she thought as they walked hand in hand out of the cinema after the end credits had rolled. Neither of them said anything, just looked at each other. When they were back at the railway station waiting for their train home, sat on a seat on the platform, Robbie was the first to speak. I enjoyed that, he said. She looked sideways at him and smirked mischievously. Do you mean the film or? He returned the smile. You know what I mean. So did I. So what now? I don't know. What now? He nodded at the signs for the toilets. Well, right now, I need to go there. Good idea. Me too. Sophie went into the ladies', where she disappeared into one of the cubicles. It never felt right to stand and pee, despite her male plumbing, and she pulled down her panties and tights and sat to relieve herself. After washing her hands and checking her makeup, she came back out onto the platform. Robbie had not yet reappeared, but along the platform a couple of youths had appeared, having just alighted from a train. She groaned, one of them was Albie Tosser, and she turned around so that he wouldn't see her. Hey, tranny! Too late. He strode up the platform towards her arrogantly, the usual leer on his face. She sighed. Hello, Albie. There was resignation in her voice. What you doing here? He demanded. Waiting for a train. Waiting for a train, he mimicked, he and the other boy sniggering. Well, you don't want to wait all on your own. Girl like you out this time o' night, anything could happen. They were right up to her now, Albie with one hand against the wall and leaning in, his face inches from hers, his breath stinking of cigarettes and cheap cider. The other boy stood in front of her, and she was aware of the hard brick wall pressing coldly against her back. Guess you need someone to look after you, he said mockingly. Course, if you were dressed like a boy like you should be, you'd be all right. He reached out to squeeze one of her false breasts, and she jerked to the side, automatically reaching out to slap his hand away. Ooh, vicious, I'll be cooed. Anyone would think they're real. Hey! Robbie was standing on the platform, silhouetted against the lights, his voice loud, commanding, and filled with anger. Albie turned to face him. Oh, got a boyfriend, lady boy? He asked Sophie, before raising his voice. Leave, wanker. Sophie's heart was pounding even more than it had in the cinema. Albie had the build and intelligence of a concrete roadblock, and even though Robbie was 3 years older and looked like a rugby player himself, he would be no match for the bully. She had a horrible vision of Robbie on the floor, being kicked and beaten, and she lunged forward frantically. No, it's all right, Robbie. Just leave it. Just leave it, Albie repeated, mimicking her again. He reached out and grabbed her arm, spinning her around to face him. Never mind him. I'll look after ya. Suddenly, Robbie was standing between them, putting his bulk in front of her protectively, and Albie's grip on her was dislodged. I said to leave, he shouted, face distorted in anger. He drew back a huge fist and aimed it at the taller boy. No! Sophie screamed, but Robbie was already moving his head to avoid it, his reaction sharp as a needle. The punch caught the edge of his ear, the fist grazing it painfully. Before he knew what was happening, he had raised his own fists in the way he had learned when sparring with Liam. Automatically he jabbed forward with his right, catching Albie on the jaw. The bully's head snapped to the side. Already off balance due to his own punch not landing, he tottered sideways clumsily, his momentum causing him to fall to the concrete in an untidy sprawl. Sophie pulled Robbie back, turning him around and walking away, pulling him with her. Thankfully, the train chose that moment to trundle into the station, rolling to a stop with the usual screech of brakes. As Albie was being helped to his feet by his companion, she bundled Robbie onto the train. They sat down as the train started moving again, and she looked out of the window anxiously, breathing a sigh of relief when she realized that Albie had not recovered enough to get on the train after them. The thought of being stuck on the train with him was not something she wanted to consider. Aware that the adrenaline was rocketing through her bloodstream, she turned her attention back to Robbie, who was sitting next to her with a look of wonderment on his face. I hit him, he said faintly, astonishment in his voice, looking at his knuckles. I bloody hit him. He turned to face her, still with the same look on his face. For a moment they looked at each other, neither knowing what to say. Sophie was the first to speak. Not bad for a nerd, she remarked eventually, and after a second or two they started to laugh as the tension eased. Sophie was suddenly aware of what he had done, and felt a new wave of love, and it was love sweep over her. She pressed herself against him, burying her face against his chest, feeling his heartbeat. Thank you, she said quietly. What for? He asked. Standing up for me against that prick. I'm glad you came back when you did, though you're a stupid twat for getting into a fight. You could have been hurt. I saw my girl in need of help, he remarked mildly. My girl! She pressed herself against him even more, feeling her heart skip a beat. Will you put your arm around me? She asked in a small voice. I like it when you do. Immediately she felt his strong arm wrap itself protectively around her shoulders. It felt daft, but it made her feel as if nothing could hurt her. Not Albie Tosser, not anyone. They traveled the short journey in silence, just enjoying each other's company as the train made its way back to Poole. When the announcement came for their stop, Sophie looked up at him. I think I've decided, she said. What? Robbie asked her. Sophie or Jackson? I think I know who I want to be. Oh, he said nonchalantly, though she knew it was just an act. I like this, she told him, complete seriousness in her voice. I don't want to be Jackson. I want to be Sophie. I want to be your girl. Robbie was silent for a moment, and she feared she may have said too much. She looked into his eyes, her sincerity plain to see, and eventually he smiled his gentle smile. I'd like you to be my girl as well, he told her, and leaned down to kiss her. Are you sure? He asked as they stepped off the train. It's a big decision. I'm sure, she said, her tone unwavering. I've never been so sure of anything. Okay, he replied. Then I'll be with you every step of the way. She stopped, hugged him and put her lips to his, her heart fluttering with delight. Around them the platform was quiet, the other half-dozen or so passengers who had alighted from the train having left through the exits, and she wished that the moment could last forever. However, now, she said. I hate to be a party pooper, but you'd better walk me home. Sophie let herself in through the front door, the sound of Match of the Day reaching her from the front room. She looked up the stairs as Lily appeared at the top, a look of delight on her face, smiled at her older sister and popped her head around the door. Dad was watching the football highlights, feet up on the settee, while Mum sat in one of the armchairs, Kindle in hand, pretending not to be interested in AFC Bournemouth's seemingly perennial struggle to stay in the Premier League. Hello, love, she said, looking up, a warm smile spreading across her face. Had a good day? Sophie nodded, knowing she was itching to ask her who it had been with. Yes, thanks. Great. I'll be heading straight on up. Oh. Night then. Night, Mum. Night, Dad. Night, sophomore. She hurried upstairs, Lily looking at her wide-eyed. Shit, she said. That snog you gave each other by the gate. I thought you were trying to suck out each other's tonsils. She followed her into Jackson's bedroom. You obviously had a good time. The date went well? Sophie switched on the light and turned to face her, throwing her handbag on the bed before sitting down next to it. She unzipped her boots, taking them off and wiggling her toes thankfully. She liked them a lot, especially the way they made her legs look, but she was glad to get them off. It did, she said, spreading her palms on the duvet beside her. The whole day was great, from start to finish. Oh, he was a bit annoyed at first 'cause he thought Liam had put me up to it well, he did. Yeah, all right, but when he realized I was serious, we went and had a good time. Went to that exhibition at the center, had a pizza and then to the cinema. What did you see? Singing in the Rain. Any good? She shook her head as she allowed herself to fall onto her back, her palms sliding across the duvet. A self-satisfied smile crept across her features and she closed her eyes. No idea. Snogging in the back row? You tart. And then we caught the train back. She thought she wouldn't mention the scene with Albie Tosser. A thought struck her sister. He didn't force you, did he? What? She asked, startled at the very thought, eyes flicking open. God, no. What now? Well, we're going to see each other next week. I take it you mean you, not Jackson? Me, Sophie. She paused. In fact, I've decided something, she added, her voice becoming more serious. She propped herself up on her elbows. What? Lily asked, noticing the sudden change in tone. She sat down next to her. I've decided that this is who I am. Sophie. Not Jackson. I want to be Sophie all the time. Lily fell silent at her announcement, looking down at her. Oh, God, she eventually said. You sure? Sophie nodded, grinning. Everybody keeps asking me that. I am. I'm a girl. Not a boy, not anymore. Is it because of how you feel about Robbie? I think it was the last piece, she replied after a moment's thought. Perhaps it was what I needed to make me finally realize it. Lily, her eyes moist, reached out and gave her sister a big hug, pulling her tightly to her in a grip of steel. Watch out! Sophie laughed. I need to breathe. When at last Lily let her go, she looked at her older sister. I want to tell Mom and Dad tomorrow. I think they'll be all right about it. I hope so, but can you be with me when I do? Of course I will, Lily told her, sniffing joyfully. Always. Thanks, big sis. Anytime, little sis. They hugged again, and Lily stood up. I'll let you get to bed. You're looking knackered. Her voice was thick, and both knew it was to save her embarrassment. She was on the verge of tears. Been quite a day, Sophie remarked. After Lily returned to her own room, Sophie got undressed, putting her outer clothes away, and removed her white bra and panties. She put her B-cup silicone boobs on the desk in the corner, somehow finding space among the school books, cosmetics, and half-completed plastic model kits, and removed her makeup, transforming herself perhaps for the last time, back into the boy she had been since birth. Jackson looked at his boy's body in the mirror, with its slim frame and small penis, and tried to imagine what Sophie would look like in 10 years' time. He couldn't quite visualize it, but trying to imagine what Jackson would look like in 10 years was even more difficult. Back in his room after cleaning his teeth and throwing his pajamas on, Jackson climbed under the duvet, reached for his tablet and typed puberty blockers into the search engine before settling down to start his research.